In 1993, the Super Mario Bros. Movie debuted to audiences everywhere. While Nintendo had previously licensed out their IP for small cartoon movies and TV shows, this was the first ever video game movie that had a worldwide theatrical release. And for exactly 20 years, we wouldn't see another major release based on a Nintendo IP until they once again decided to try making another Super Mario Bros. Movie, but this time through animation. Of course, these aren't the only options because we've seen video games adapted into every kind of category over the last 30 years. From live action to animation, films to television, Saturday morning cartoons for kids on network television to gory anime on a streaming service that is definitely 100% not for children. We've seen the good, the bad, the great, the not so great, the ones that might have been a little bit divisive, and we've even seen a few that might have actually traumatized a few kids. And during that entire time, studios have been begging to do a Legend of Zelda movie or TV show, with Nintendo continuously telling them no. But now that the door is back open for Nintendo licensing out their popular franchises to studios, we know more IPs will be getting adapted soon. But with so many possibilities, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of adaptation will we likely see for The Legend of Zelda? Hey everybody, it's Kevra. It's me, I'm Kevra. Hey. Hey guys, welcome back to How to Adapt The Legend of Zelda. In the first video, we talked about the different stories you could tell when adapting the Legend of Zelda franchise. If you haven't watched that video yet, link up in the corner, make sure you watch that one before you watch this one because this one is about the appropriate medium to match it. In other words, is it going to be a movie or television show? Animation or live action? Now the first option I want to talk about is the idea of The Legend of Zelda being a live action TV show. I started writing these videos back in 2019. On and off. Just to clarify, it's not like I've been working on this thing for 3.5 years straight. It's been, sometimes I'm working on it, sometimes I'm not. Okay. But in February 2021, we discovered that the rumored live-action Legend of Zelda television show over at Netflix back in 2015 was actually a real thing. The claim is that Nintendo got paranoid because the information was leaked.
But when Netflix leaked it, they freaked out and they pulled the plug on everything. They pulled the plug on the entire program to adapt these things.
I've seen a few conspiracy theories suggest that the real reason is because Nintendo realized that doing a live-action Legend of Zelda would be a terrible idea. And while I'm sure that most of these people don't actually believe that, but instead just say that because they themselves don't want a live-action version of The Legend of Zelda, I still see a lot of people say it, along with some other crazy theories. But if you actually listen to Adam Conover's interview, and you know who he is, then you know that the conspiracy theories don't make sense. Adam Conover was working at College Humor back when the Legend of Zelda show was in development over at Netflix. And during that time, College Humor was also working on a Star Fox claymation show. When the leak happened about Netflix, Nintendo pulled the plug on both The Legend of Zelda and the Star Fox claymation show. And Adam's boss at College Humor was told the reason they pulled out was because of the leak. Now, it's technically possible his boss lied to him about the real reason Nintendo pulled out, or even that Nintendo lied to his boss. But no conspiracy theory that I've heard explains why the Star Fox show was also canceled. Also, for anyone who thinks Adam Conover lied, I guess it's technically possible, but usually the kind of person who makes up these lies are the ones who make money off the clickbait crap they keep coming up with. I heard from an incredibly reliable source within Nintendo that every single Nintendo game ever is coming to Nintendo Switch. Click on me, click on me, click on me, click on me. But Adam Conover said it on a podcast that wasn't even his, which would mean that he made clickbait crap on something he wasn't even making money off of. Also, right after Adam Conover talks about Nintendo pulling out, he mentions he doesn't even like the idea of Zelda being in live action.
Yeah, that's terrible.
I'm glad they didn't do it. Live action Legend of Zelda, no.
It would have been great.
So he's on the same side of anyone who's championing the idea for it being animation, which is why it's a bit weird some of those same people are getting angry at him and calling him a liar. It's even weirder when you add in the fact that he has a show called Adam Ruins Everything, where he basically just points out things that are false that people believe. Do me a favor, Next time you see an article, just go ahead and click on it. Yeah. Usually there's more information other than just what the headline says. Sometimes, not always. However, although it seems incredibly likely Nintendo was in fact talking to Netflix about doing a live-action Legend of Zelda series, I don't think it would have worked. And this is coming from someone who wanted exactly that ever since he was a kid. But we don't always get what we want, and here's why. If you want to do a Legend of Zelda television series, it's going to be really difficult to do live action. The reason? Money. Lots of money. Ridiculously big bags of money. Or as the Hylians refer to it as, rupees. So here's the thing. If Nintendo hadn't canceled the project back when the leak happened, it would have been canceled later when Netflix realized just how ridiculously expensive it would be to make a good-looking, live-action Legend of Zelda show. Not only because they'd either be building a lot of fancy sets or doing a lot of green screen for locations like Hyrule Castle, Goron City, and Zora's Domain, but also populating those places with Gorons, Zoras, Koroks, Ritos, or other strange intelligent races that inhabit the different areas of the Legend of Zelda world. The only reasonable way you could do it is if you treated it like the first two games, where the only non-human characters were the creatures Link fought. And while Netflix probably would have been fine with that, I think Nintendo is smart enough to know that the fans would be incredibly disappointed if the only intelligent races we got were the human characters. Actually, Hylians and humans aren't the same thing. You see, yes, I am aware that Hylians and humans aren't the same thing. But anytime we talk about something that doesn't need motion capture or a ton of prosthetics, that's gonna get lumped into the human category. Because all you really need is like maybe pointy ears or different colored contacts or it's something that's really simple. Now, I've already had this live-action Zelda series debate with lots of my friends in real life. So before you start commenting down below on why I'm wrong, I already know your two biggest arguments. The Witcher and Game of Thrones. Both of those shows are set in fantasy worlds and do have CGI creatures, but not like Zelda would. Game of Thrones is mostly humans talking with humans with the occasional dragon in a scene here or there, or maybe a CGI army for the really expensive episodes with a big battle. That's very different than Link running around Death Mountain, talking to a bunch of Gorons for a whole episode while he tries to help them with their big problem, and then the next episode, he does the exact same thing but with the Zoras. This same logic applies towards The Witcher. Go back and rewatch that show. It's mostly Henry Cavill or other main characters that are humans talking to other humans with big impressive CGI sprinkled throughout. But there is one decent argument that's out there, and that's The Mandalorian. Unlike Game of Thrones and The Witcher, The Mandalorian didn't have to build as many big set pieces or film on location that much. For a large portion of the show, they used something called the volume, which not only gave them the ability to film green screen in ways that had never been done before, but they also even talk about pre-planning shots and pre-production by treating it like a video game in some aspects. However, I still think that Netflix would have canceled that Zelda show because The Mandalorian and the volume didn't even exist until 2019. And again, the Zelda show at Netflix was canceled in 2015. But even with the current technology, I still think that the budget would just be too high for a live-action show. So my first reason is the lesser of the two reasons, and that first reason is licensing costs. Oh, companies paying other companies to use their IPs. This conversation's going fun places. Don't worry, this is only gonna take a second. Now, I won't get into deep specifics because all licensing agreements can be different and complicated, but Netflix absolutely would have had to pay Nintendo to even do a Legend of Zelda TV show. They're spending millions of dollars that's not even going towards production. It's just going into Nintendo's pocket so Netflix can even make the show. That's one way it's different than The Mandalorian, which Disney doesn't have to pay another company just to license it because they own Star Wars. I mean, okay, they did have to pay like $4 billion for the rights to Star Wars, but, you know, they made $5 billion at the box office for like the first few movies. Although, the theaters do keep like a third of that. But, you know, they're still making money off of merchandising, Blu-ray sales, you know, streaming. They made their money back. Mandalorian was the freebie. Now, the other bigger and more important difference is that the alien races in The Mandalorian don't really look that different than what they looked like in the 70s. Most of the alien races in The Mandalorian are done in one of two ways. The first option is people in masks that make weird noises, and that's clearly not expensive. The other main type of aliens that they make consist of people who can just do face paint blended with headgear and basically just wear normal clothing to cover up their alien bodies. One of the few exceptions to the rule was Queel, but honestly, it looked like his mouth movement didn't match most of the time.
I bought my freedom through the skill of my hands.
That's not to say that I didn't enjoy the character, I'm just saying that it looked like puppetry, and I think that's partially why they never did it again. And I'm specifically talking about puppetry that involves mouth movement where the character is speaking in English. Because there is a lot of great puppetry and a lot of great practical effects in The Mandalorian, but Queel was just not one of them. Also, I do want to point out that yes, there were CGI characters, yes, there was a bit of motion capture, but it's not the majority. Which is why, even though these shows are very comparable to The Legend of Zelda in some circumstances, like how The Mandalorian or The Witcher has this one big monster scene every episode or two where he fights this giant creature, or how all of these shows take place in a fantastical world that involve a lot of set building and a lot of green screen, the big difference is the characters, because all the shows I just mentioned focus on human or human-like characters. So if you want Gorons that roll and have abnormally large mouths but still look real when they talk, or if you want Zoras that are 10 feet tall, swim fast, and look good because they put a lot of money into making them motion captured or putting several actors in full bodysuits that would take several hours to put on, that's gonna be a lot harder for a television series. So, because it would be really expensive to do all the different races for several episodes, that would either leave us with a show that doesn't look good, or Link is only going to be with those other races for a limited time, because if he's not, the budget is going to balloon and the project will be canceled for the same reason the BioShock movie could never get off the ground. BioShock was too expensive for an R-rated movie, and The Legend of Zelda would be too expensive as a live-action TV show. That's why, if it's a TV series, it would make way more sense for them to do animation. And yeah, I know what some of you are going to say. The Legend of Zelda already has a horrible animated television show. But that was 30 years ago! And that technically wasn't even an actual show, that was a segment within another show. In fact, that's actually the reason why I tend to argue that we've never even had an actual adaptation of The Legend of Zelda. But even though I don't count it, I still acknowledge it to be absolutely terrible, and I also acknowledge that we've had other really bad animated television shows over the years. But you have to acknowledge that there's also been some pretty good ones that were perfectly suited for television. Pokemon the animated series has been entertaining kids for over 20 years. And having Castlevania become an anime was a perfect choice. It was a lesser known series, which meant it would have had a harder time justifying a big live action budget. And Castlevania fit perfectly for the type of anime fans who love blood, gore, and guts all over the place. Yeah, I'll admit, I'm not one of those people. I prefer the intestines to stay on the inside of people as opposed to, spread out all over the floor. But that's just me. However, that's specifically if they did the television route. If they wanted to do a movie, it would very likely be a big budget live action film. I mean, even our childhood animated movies are being adapted into live action now. Then again, the live action version of The Lion King was completely animated outside of one shot. So I guess words don't matter anymore. I mean, we still say filming even though we don't use film anymore. That's weird. Yeah. Studios are also known for wanting to make either big budget action movies based on existing IPs or small budget films that are a low risk to lose money on because they're so cheap to make. The Legend of Zelda definitely falls into the big budget category that a movie studio would love to take a gamble on to be their next big cash cow. And the reason they wouldn't want to go the cheaper route of animation is because it doesn't really fit the mold of popular animation in American cinemas. There's barely any Japanese anime style movies that get screened in American cinemas, and when they do, they don't perform that well. Which you can blame on marketing, but that's a whole other debate. The point that I'm making is that the animation we mostly have, and that does really well globally, are things like musicals, like Frozen or Moana, or movies about childhood and family like Toy Story, Inside Out, or Finding Nemo, or things that have adorable pet-like creatures like the movie Pets or How to Train Your Dragon. An orphaned young adult journeying across a kingdom doesn't exactly scream family friendly. At least not to a big studio that's going to be financing this project. Although, now that I'm thinking about it, Link does have a pet horse. So if we just give Epona lots of adorable expressions along with the ability to talk... Kidding, please shoot me if that ever happens. But like in the leg, because I don't want to die. However, that only leaves one option left. And for all of you who want Link to never speak, I have some good news. He won't speak. For he shall sing. Ganondorf, you are my ruin. Zelda, my one true princess. Kidding! Oh my god, joking about things that make you want to kill yourself are the best. Now the final point that I want to make on why the movie would likely not be animated is because live action is more popular. Look, don't hate me for saying that. I'm just going by the numbers. I mean, I love the Mother series. Earthbound is one of the greatest games of all time in my opinion, but that doesn't mean that it sells well and that it's popular, and I have to accept that. To further illustrate this point, let's start off by looking at Spider-Man's box office numbers. Now I know that this information will change because more Spider-Man movies will come out, but at the time of recording this, there have been 9 Spider-Man movies theatrically released. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse was the only one that was animated, and it pulled in the lowest box office numbers despite being one of the best Spider-Man movies. It made only $375 million, which is practically half as much as the box office numbers for the very hated The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which is the second worst performing Spider-Man movie, earning $709 million. Man, I wish I could suck that hard. Edit that out. Pokemon is another good example. The animated movie is the 15th highest grossing video game movie, coming in at $164 million. But the live action Detective Pikachu film is the second highest grossing video game movie at $432 million, which is more than 2.5 times the animated version. And the animated version was released during a time that Pokemon had taken the world by storm. You guys remember Pokemania being a thing back in the 90s? You weren't born then? I'm old. Yes, people do love animation. People love anime. I'm not arguing that no one does. Heck, I think that Into the Spider-Verse is either the second best or the best Spider-Man movie ever made and is grossly underappreciated. I watched Avatar: The Last Airbender a couple of years ago for the first time, and I can safely say that is a terrific show for people of all ages. You know, I'm not even trying to argue that animation isn't popular, but it doesn't have the mass appeal that live action does because almost everyone likes live action. And while I recognize not everyone does, if you look at the highest grossing movies of all time, the first 9 are live action and the 10th movie is Frozen 2. If you look at the top 20 highest grossing movies of all time, 17 of them are live action. And if you look at the top 100 highest grossing movies of all time, the only non-Disney animated films were sequels to Shrek, Despicable Me, and Ice Age. Ice Age is about a bunch of animals. Despicable Me is about family as Groot becomes a father to 3 small children. And Shrek's sidekick is a talking donkey. Now, I know a lot of you are gonna argue that that doesn't matter because American animation is dumb. They're immature comedies for children, and Zelda isn't a comedy. It can have comedy, but it's more emotional and dramatic, which is more comparable to something in the style of anime. But unfortunately, when it comes to anime, that's even less successful. That's not to say that it isn't successful. It makes money and it's gaining more popularity. However, from a global perspective, it still appeals to more of a niche audience. Further proof of that is looking at the highest grossing anime films of all time. Demon Slayer is number 1, raking in $506 million. But if you're looking at a list of all movies, then the highest grossing anime film of all time is still beaten by 228 other films. And even when you're looking at just a list of the highest grossing animated films, there isn't a single anime film that even cracks the top 50. So for anyone that was confused as to why the Super Mario Bros. Movie was made on the other side of the world when Nintendo have big anime studios right next door in Japan, that's the reason why. Mario is Nintendo's most valuable IP, and Western studios have more money to spend on licensing, making these projects, and these studios get much bigger returns on their investments. And although the Super Mario Bros. Movie hasn't come out yet, I think it will do significantly well at the box office and not only become the highest grossing video game movie, but I think it will crack $1 billion at the box office or at least come close. I mean, Mario is a character that's recognized by almost everyone in the world. Unlike this guy, who people still call Zelda. Mario also fits animation perfectly. There's practically no human characters in the Mushroom Kingdom, the creature-like characters are adorable, and his version of violence is stepping on goofy creatures' heads or swinging them by the tail. Whereas Link's weapon of choice is a sword. Yeah, I can already see this being a big PTO meeting with moms who have nothing else to do. So for all those reasons that I just listed over the past 20 minutes, I think that's why it comes down to picking between either doing an animated TV show or a live action movie. Hypothetically, technology might be good enough to do an amazing Legend of Zelda live action TV show for a reasonable budget in the near future, and hypothetically, anime movies might become so popular in the future that America's cinemas start showing them more and more often because Hollywood will take a cash cow in any form, especially when it's cheap to make. But that's not the current world that we live in, so we are ignoring the hypotheticals. In fact, when you look at the track record when it comes to video game adaptations, most of the movies have been live action, and most of the shows have been animated. Now, obviously, that's not to say that there aren't also adaptations that are live action shows or animated films. Heck, Pokemon will literally have done it all if that live action Pokemon series Netflix is developing actually comes out. However, picking a live action show or an animated film is simply going against the odds. And we're not doing that here. We are being rational, sensible adults. But it's still okay to cry. Not like that, though. Okay, now that we've narrowed it down to the most two practical choices for a studio to finance and make, we're going to talk about Nintendo and the choice they would likely make. To do that, you have to put yourselves in their shoes, and I want you to think about two things. The first is Nintendo's image throughout the years. The second thing that I want you to think about is all of the flagship titles that Nintendo has. In the eye of the general public, Nintendo typically has one of two images. They're either seen as the company that makes games and consoles that are accessible to everyone, or as the kiddie version of PlayStation and Xbox. That second perspective is partially due to Sega making it their goal in the 90s to make Nintendo look childish, while Sega marketed themselves to seem more mature and for teens, because they figured if the older brother wanted to play the more mature Sega console, then the younger brother would also want to, meaning that everyone would rather play Sega, both young and old. And that marketing worked. Since then, Nintendo has struggled with their image, and even Shigeru Miyamoto hated that Mario in the 90s was seen as kiddish, and actually wanted Mario to stop using the peace symbol for that exact reason. Because peace is clearly just for children. I guess. What? I do think that their image has gotten better over the years, and that they have been more and more seen as the console for everyone. But some people see their kid-friendly games and their less powerful hardware being just for kids. And when you look at their flagship titles compared to Microsoft and Sony, it kind of makes sense, because while the other two consoles have more mature titles like Halo, Uncharted, God of War, when you think of Nintendo games, you think about the ones kids can play like Super Mario, Donkey Kong, Pokemon, Splatoon, Kirby, Pikmin, Star Fox. And all of those titles perfectly fit animation. Pokemon is the only one on that list that makes sense to do as live action because the main character can be an actual human and it also can be set in a very real world. However, because it's Pokemon, it still has to be geared specifically for kids, which is why Detective Pikachu is a good movie, but I would also argue it's a good kids movie because of how predictable and simple the script was. Still very entertaining, but I'm just saying you could tell what audience they had in mind when writing the script. Also, Nintendo doesn't actually own Pokemon, they only own like a third of Pokemon, so it's technically not really theirs, but so there are really only two iconic franchises that Nintendo has that wouldn't have to be specifically geared towards children. They could be more of that soft PG-13 where it's accessible towards children, but it's written for an adult audience in mind to remind people Nintendo isn't just for kids. So it would be like a lot of superhero movies, or the Avatar movies, or a lot of the Harry Potter films. Something in that vein, where yes, a lot of adults show up, but it's still accessible towards children. Now, one of those two iconic Nintendo franchises that could fit that mold is Metroid. But with how expensive it would be to make it into a live-action space adventure, a studio might be a little bit hesitant to go with a game franchise that has never been a big seller despite it being around for over 35 years. If a studio was going to take a big financial gamble on a live-action movie that helped Nintendo have the image of not being just for children, it would be The Legend of Zelda. I know a lot of Zelda fans want it to be anime, and while I don't disagree with the logic that Nintendo is a Japanese company and that it makes sense to stick with the style Japan is mostly known for, it seems like they are trying to break out of their own bubble and trying to reach a wider audience. They're doing a Super Mario Bros. Movie with Universal, they were trying to do a Star Fox show with College Humor, and they went to Netflix about doing a live-action Legend of Zelda show. It really makes sense for them to branch out, and The Legend of Zelda is the best pick for live action. Because while I do think animation would be a good choice for The Legend of Zelda, I think animation is a better choice for the other Nintendo franchises. In fact, I actually argue that making a Metroid anime might be the best decision for Nintendo because Metroid doesn't do well in Japan. So making an anime version of it might spark a lot more interest in that particular market. Hell, I usually say my favorite game of all time is Earthbound, and I think it makes way more sense as an anime show because of how weird and abstract it is. Plus, as much as I love Earthbound, I know it doesn't sell well, so I can't see it getting a big live action budget. So yeah, it's not that I hate animation or that I just love live action and want everything to be in live action. It's just that The Legend of Zelda is one of Nintendo's few IPs that makes sense as live action. Now, I could be wrong. I think what I'm saying makes a lot of sense, which is why I said it, but we are also talking about a company that's notorious for doing things you do not expect. I mean, just when you think they're gonna zig, they hit you in the back of the head with a shovel, knocking you unconscious so they can take you down to Mexico where they're gonna harvest your organs, and you think they're gonna sell them on the black market, but oh no, they actually put them in a wooden bowl so they can use them in some sort of ritual to sacrifice to the Mario God so they can have one more good fiscal year at Nintendo. I mean, we've seen it a million times, and yet we never see it coming. So who knows, because Nintendo is the definition of a wild card. Maybe Nintendo only went to Netflix about a Legend of Zelda adaptation because it was during their Wii U days and desperately wanted Zelda to become as recognizable as Mario with people around the world because of how poorly the Wii U was doing. Or maybe Nintendo went to Netflix because they had a really great Legend of Zelda story idea that was brand new and they absolutely wanted to do it as a series because it wouldn't work as a video game. Maybe Netflix was even the one that twisted Nintendo's arm to make it live action because Netflix thought they would get more views that way. You know, it could also be that Nintendo wants to do both. I mean, The Wind Waker and Twilight Princess are the perfect example of them trying to capture two very different types of audiences. The first Zelda on the GameCube they made had adorable animation that made it more marketable towards kids. Then the fans cried foul, so Nintendo canceled The Wind Waker 2 and made Twilight Princess, and then lied to us by saying it was always the plan to do one Zelda game that was more accessible to kids and another game that was more mature because they didn't want to lose their older fans. And right now, it seems like they're trying to capitalize on the massive success of Breath of the Wild and try to cater to that older audience once again by showing us what appears to be a darker Zelda game where Ganondorf kind of looks like a redhead. In fact, because they like to appeal to young and old, I think they actually would try to do both animation and live action, which is kind of what they're doing with The Witcher. I'm not saying that The Witcher is trying to appeal to children through animation. I'm just saying that it had a really successful live action TV show, and then they also did a smaller story through animation once the live action show was a huge success. So it makes sense they would do something similar with Zelda, where they start with these big, larger-than-life live-action movies, then do a smaller, more light-hearted animation series. I also think the Zelda live-action movie would be through Universal. Super Nintendo World just opened up at Universal Studios in Japan. They're working on more across the world, and they're currently working on a Donkey Kong expansion for the one in Japan. Then we have Illumination, who's owned by Universal, making a Super Mario Bros. Movie. And I guarantee that at some point, while Miyamoto was helping Universal Studios create Nintendo Land, or going over the Super Mario Bros. Movie for the past few years with Universal, that the idea of a Legend of Zelda live-action movie was at least briefly talked about. And I'm not even talking about like a serious conversation, but maybe just like for shits and giggles, they're like, oh, maybe this is what it could be. Or maybe Miyamoto talked about what the potential idea was over at Netflix before they pulled the plug. I mean, Nintendo and Universal already seem to have a pretty good relationship. And if the Super Mario Bros. Movie does well, which I expect it will, not only will they expand that universe by doing Luigi Mansion movies, by doing Donkey Kong movies, but they will also likely be expanding into live action with The Legend of Zelda. And if that goes well, we are going to see The Legend of Zelda through all different types of mediums. Because unlike Mario, Zelda has so much more lore to explore. It would likely be just like how we have a million different versions of Batman when it comes to movies, animated shows, video games, and so on. So for Zelda, you have the big live action movie that's kind of for everyone, where you adapt the games to introduce new people or non-gamers to the world that we already know and love. Then you have an animated series for the kiddos so you can hook them while they're young, which is probably the purpose of the Super Mario Bros. Movie. And then they could even do darker style anime movies. These would be more for the hardcore fans and probably not use the word Zelda in the title, so you know it's not for kids. It could be something like The Legend of the Interloper War, which is something I really want to see. In fact, I actually want to do videos on all these different types of projects later. But right now, we're sticking with adapting the games into movies. Now, I know there's some of you out there that believe it has to be a television show because a movie would be too short, and I was one of those people for a very long time. But now I realize if you're adapting the stories from the games, there's way more problems with it being a television show than a movie. But that topic falls more in line with my next video, which is all about the things you have to do, and more importantly, the things you can't do while adapting The Legend of Zelda. It's the basic rules that could be applied to almost all of the Zelda games. So instead of repeating them in every single video as we talk about adapting each game, the next video will cover all of those particular rules. But let me know what you thought about this video. Where do you fall when it comes to animation versus live action? Do you have a personal preference, or like me, do you actually want both? And which do you think will come first? Also, if you want to make sure that you continue to go on this journey of how to adapt The Legend of Zelda, make sure you subscribe. That way, you know when the next video is coming out. Basic rules. Until next time, I'll catch you later.